Hello everyone. In today's video, we will be going to discuss paper 1 of O-level biology 5090. This is the latest paper, that is October-November 2021. Let's start. MCQ number 1. 4 features found in the animal cells are listed: cell membrane, chloroplasts, nucleus, and starch grains. Which 2 features are found in animal cells? So, as you all know, the cell membrane and nucleus, these both features are found in animal cells, and the other features which are listed, such as the chloroplasts and starch grains, they are specific to the plant cells. Chloroplasts and starch grains are only found in plant cells, they are not found in animal cells. So the answer is 1 and 3, which is B. Let's move on to the next MCQ, that is MCQ number 2. Which statement about diffusion is correct? Diffusion always involves the movement of water molecules. No, this is the wrong statement, because the diffusion can involve any molecule, right? Any molecule can diffuse from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. It can be a water molecule, it can be carbon dioxide molecule, it can be oxygen molecule, it can be any molecule that can diffuse. Diffusion depends on the presence of a partially permeable membrane. Guys, please remember that diffusion never requires a partially permeable membrane. If there is no partially permeable membrane, diffusion can still occur. Diffusion can also occur through a partially permeable membrane. Partially permeable membrane is not a requirement. Partially permeable membrane is only required for osmosis and active transport. It's not required for diffusion. And this is a very important point that the examiner keeps on testing. So do remember this point. Option C says diffusion only happens to the molecules. Diffusion only happens to the molecules in a solution. This is not true. Diffusion can occur in solution, but gases can also diffuse when they are not in solution. Any molecule, whether in solution or whether out of the solution, can diffuse from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Diffusion only involves molecules moving down a concentration gradient. This is true. As I mentioned earlier, that diffusion involves the movement of molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, that is down a concentration gradient. So the answer is D. Let's look at the MCQ number 3. An experiment to investigate osmosis is set up as shown. What happens to the height of the liquid in the tube X and the concentration of the salt solution? Okay, if we look at the apparatus, we can see that there is a bag which contains salt solution. The bag has a wall which is partially permeable, or we can say the bag is covered by a partially permeable membrane, and this bag is put into a distilled water. The bag is open at one end, and there's a tube which is inserted into the bag, and there is some liquid level in the tube X. Okay, so if we look at the two different substances, one is salt solution and one is distilled water. So salt solution is in the bag and distilled water is in the beaker. Okay, if we compare the two solutions, distilled water is a pure water, so it has the highest water potential. So distilled water will have higher water potential. As it is pure, it does not have any solute. Whereas the salt solution has salt dissolved in water. So because of the salt, the water potential will decrease. So it has a lower water potential. And as we all know, that water flows from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential by osmosis. So what will happen? That water will enter the bag from the distilled water into the salt solution by osmosis. And because of this, the liquid level in the tube X will rise. So the height of the liquid in the tube increases. What about the concentration of the salt solution? Because the salt solution is gaining water, the water is entering into the salt solution is becoming dilute. So the concentration of the salt solution will decrease. Always remember this point, that when a solution gains water, it becomes dilute. There is now more water as compared to the solute. So the concentration of the solution decreases. If a solution is losing water, that means its concentration increases, because now the solute will be more and the water will be less. The answer for this MCQ is C. Let's move on to the MCQ number 4. Which statement about enzymes is always correct? It should always be correct. They change the reactions to produce different end products. Guys, this is definitely a wrong statement, because if an enzyme catalyzes the reaction, or if the enzyme is added to a reaction, the enzyme speeds up the reaction and does not change the products that are formed. For example, if this is a reaction that is A plus B forming C plus D, so if I don't use an enzyme, the products will be C and D. And if I use an enzyme, the products will still be C and D. Enzyme has no influence. No, enzyme does not change the products that are formed or the reactants that are being used. So always remember that enzyme only affects the speed of the reaction. Enzyme only increases the speed of reaction. It does not change the products that are being formed. Okay, let's look at the option B. They change the rate of reaction. Yes, they do. They increase the rate of reaction. They catalyze reactions inside the body cells. Not necessarily. You can take the enzymes out of the cells and you can use the enzymes in the lab where they can catalyze the reactions. So enzymes can work inside the body cells. They can also work outside the body cells. They catalyze the reactions at body temperature. Not necessarily. Enzymes can even work at temperatures below 37 degrees Celsius or even at temperatures above 37 degrees Celsius. So not necessarily, this is not necessary that they only catalyze the reaction at body temperature. So option D is also wrong. Let's move on to MCQ number 5. This is a very good question. The graphs show factors affecting the rate of photosynthesis. So we have graphs for 3 different factors which are affecting the rate of photosynthesis. These factors are the light intensity, carbon dioxide concentration, and temperature. At which points on the graph could the rate of photosynthesis be limited by carbon dioxide concentration? So in this MCQ, they are asking about the points where carbon dioxide concentration is the limiting factor. Okay, guys, let me give you some tips to identify the limiting factor. Identifying limiting factors. Number 1 point. If you increase the amount of a factor, and this increase results in increase in rate of photosynthesis, this means that the factor you increased, this means that the factor that is increased is the limiting factor. What does this mean? That if you increase any factor and rate of photosynthesis also increases, this means that that factor is the limiting factor. For example, at point 1, we are increasing the light intensity, and because of this, the rate of photosynthesis increases. So at 1, light intensity is the limiting factor. What about at 2? At 2, we are increasing the light intensity and the rate of photosynthesis does not increase. This means that light intensity is not a limiting factor. Any other factor can be limiting, such as CO2 concentration or temperature could be limiting. Any one out of 2. One of 2 could be limiting. Okay, let's move on to this graph. So on x-axis, we have carbon dioxide concentration, and on y-axis, we have rate of photosynthesis. So if we talk about point 3, so if we are increasing carbon dioxide concentration, at point 3, what happens? Rate of photosynthesis also increases. This means by increasing carbon dioxide concentration, rate of photosynthesis increases. It means at point 3, CO2 concentration or carbon dioxide concentration is a limiting factor. What about 4? As we are increasing the carbon dioxide concentration, there is no effect on the rate. The rate is constant. This means that at 4, CO2 concentration is not a limiting factor. Some other factor might be limiting. Okay, let's talk about the third graph. So if we talk about 0.5, so after we increase the temperature beyond 0.5, the rate of photosynthesis falls. It means temperature is not a limiting factor over here, right? If you increase the temperature, for example, if there was a point over here and we are increasing temperature, so rate of photosynthesis is also increasing. So at this point, temperature is definitely a limiting factor, but at 5, it is not a limiting factor, because beyond this point, when we are increasing temperature, the rate of photosynthesis is falling and not rising. Okay, and we can also say that at 0.5 is the optimum temperature at which the rate of photosynthesis is maximum. So at optimum temperature, obviously temperature is not a limiting factor. Some other factor might be limiting. So CO2 concentration or light intensity are limiting. So 1 out of 2 factors. Let's come on to the question. They're asking us that at which points carbon dioxide concentration can be limiting. So carbon dioxide concentration is limiting at 3. What else? At 2, because at 2, light intensity is not a limiting factor. Carbon dioxide concentration or temperature could be limiting. So at 2, it could be limiting. At 1, light intensity is limiting, not carbon dioxide concentration. And at 5, temperature is not limiting. So light intensity or carbon dioxide concentration could be limiting. So at 5, carbon dioxide concentration is limiting. The answer is C, 2, 3, and 5. If we talk about 6, we don't have any idea about 6. If we talk about 4, so CO2 concentration is not limiting. This means option D is wrong. Again, over here, we get 4. So option B is wrong as well. And at 1, light intensity is a limiting factor. So option A is also wrong. The answer is C. Let's move on to MCQ number 6. The diagram shows the arrangement of cells inside a green leaf. Different types of cells are indicated by the brackets. No cell contents are shown. Which types of cells contain chloroplasts? Okay, so if we talk about the V layer is the upper epidermis, and it contains epidermal cells. So these flat cells are basically epidermal cells, and as we all know that epidermal cells do not contain chloroplasts. So in upper epidermis, only epidermal cells are drawn. There are no guard cells. So epidermal cells do not contain chloroplasts. W is palisade mesophyll, and palisade mesophyll cells contain chloroplasts. X is spongy mesophyll. Also, spongy mesophyll cells contain chloroplast. And if we talk about Y, so Y is again the lower epidermis, and these are epidermal cells which do not contain chloroplast. Z include guard cells. Always remember that guard cells contain chloroplasts. So cells Y and cells Y are the lower epidermal cells. They do not contain chloroplasts. Cells V are the upper epidermal cells. They do not contain chloroplasts. If you find guard cells in the epidermis, guard cells contain chloroplasts, and palisade and spongy mesophyll cells always contain chloroplasts. So W, X, and Z will be the answer. The answer is D. 7. MCQ number 7. What will happen to a plant that does not receive enough magnesium ions from the soil? Guys, please remember that magnesium ions are required to make chlorophyll. And as you all know, that chlorophyll is required for photosynthesis. So if a plant is deficient in magnesium, the plant will not be able to make sufficient chlorophyll, and the leaves will turn yellow, because the color of the leaves is because of the color of the leaves is due to chlorophyll. And if there is deficiency of chlorophyll due to magnesium deficiency, the leaves will turn yellow. Also, because of the chlorophyll deficiency, there will be decreased rate of photosynthesis, the photosynthesis will decrease, and less nutrients will be available to the plant, less carbohydrates, and eventually less amino acids. So poor growth or stunted growth. So the plant will have stunted growth and yellow leaves. Plant will not have elongated stems. For that, the plant must grow well. Let's discuss MCQ number 8. The table shows the colors obtained after testing 3 different foods for carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Okay, so we have 3 different types of foods: food X, food Y, and food Z. All right. So on food X, when the Benedict's test was performed, the color change was red. So as you all know that we carry out Benedict's test to test for reducing sugars. Benedict's test, in Benedict's test, we use Benedict's reagent, which is blue in color. And if the color changes from blue to green, yellow, orange, or red, that means reducing sugars are present. So in food X, reducing sugars are present, which is shown by the red color of the Benedict's reagent. When we carried out iodine test, the color changed to black from yellow-brown. This shows that food X also contains starch. So this means that food X contains which type of molecules? It contains carbohydrates, because reducing sugars and starch belong to the category called carbohydrates. The bioid region stays blue and the ethanol emulsion is clear, which shows that these 2 tests are negative and proteins and fats are absent, whereas these 2 tests are positive, showing that carbohydrates are present. Let's have a look on food Y. So when we carried out bioret test on food Y, the color turned violet. As you all know that bioret test is carried out to test for proteins, and in the bioret test we use bioret reagent. Bioret reagent is blue in color, and if the color changes from blue to purple or any other shades of purple like the violet, mauve, or the lilac, it means proteins are present. So food Y contains proteins. What about food Z? Food Z shows milky white emulsion with ethanol immersion test. This means that fats are present in food Z. As you all know that for fats, we carry out immersion test in which first we add ethanol and then after that we add few drops of water. So if a milky white emulsion is formed, that means fats are present. If clear emulsion is formed, that means fats are absent. So in food Z, milky white emulsion was seen. That means food Z contains fats. So the answer is A. Let's move on to the MCQ number 9. Which statement about chemical digestion in the human alimentary canal is correct? So guys, for chemical digestion, what you need to know, chemical digestion is the breakdown of large molecules into small molecules. To remember that. This is chemical digestion and not physical or mechanical. This is chemical digestion, which involves the breakdown of large molecules into small molecules. By what? By enzyme action. By enzymes. Let's have a look at each statement and we need to take the correct statement. Digestion of carbohydrates is completed in colon. This statement is absolutely wrong because please guys remember this thing, that digestion of all the substances is completed in the ileum and not the colon. Colon is the site of absorption of water and mineral ions. Enzymes are secreted to break down cellulose in the duodenum. So guys, remember that we are talking about humans, and humans do not produce any enzyme that breaks down cellulose. So this statement is wrong. Herbivores can digest cellulose, but humans cannot digest cellulose. They cannot break down cellulose because they cannot produce an enzyme called cellulase. Option C, protein digestion is completed in the ileum. This is true. Guys, all sorts of digestions are completed in ileum and absorption begins in the ileum. The stomach secretes enzymes to break down starch. This is wrong because stomach secretes an enzyme called pepsin and pepsin breaks down proteins. It's a protease. It does not break down starch. So starch breakdown does not occur in the stomach. This is a wrong statement, the answer is C. Let's move on to MCQ number 10. Which two nutrients can lead to deformed bones if there is a deficiency of either of them in the diet? So you guys should know that for strong bones and teeth, we need two substances in diet, vitamin D and calcium. Calcium is a mineral ion and vitamin D is a vitamin. So calcium is required to make your bones stronger and your teeth stronger, and vitamin D is required for the absorption of calcium from the food. So vitamin D is equally required as calcium to make bones stronger. So the answer is B, because if the calcium and vitamin D or either one of them becomes deficient, so the bones will be deformed. That means that the bones will be weak and they will fracture easily. And in children, the bones, while forming, will not be formed properly and will be deformed. So the answer is B. The diagram shows a section through a plant stem. Which process is responsible for moving substances in region G? Z. Okay. So guys, you should know that this is the cross section of a stem, and in stem, what we observe, we see many vascular bundles. These are the vascular bundles, and in the vascular bundles we find xylem and phloem. Okay, let's label which region is xylem, which region is phloem. So guys, the outer region is the phloem and the inner region is the xylem. In between phloem and xylem, there is a region called cambium. So the region Z is phloem, and substances flow in phloem by translocation. The answer is C. Which process is responsible for moving substances in the region Z, that is the phloem? Translocation occurs in phloem. Translocation is the transport of sucrose and amino acids from source to sink. Source is the site where sucrose and amino acids are produced, and sink is the site where sucrose and amino acids are required. What is transpiration? So guys, do know that transpiration is the loss of water vapor from the leaf. Water vapor is lost from the leaf by diffusing through the stomata. So option A says evaporation of water from the stomata. No, water never evaporates from the stomata. It diffuses across the stomata. Stomata are basically the pores between the guard cells. So through these pores, water vapor diffuses. It never evaporates from that side. Evaporation of water at the surface of the spongy mesophyll, or we can say mesophyll cells, and it's lost through the stomata. This is the right answer for transpiration. What happens during transpiration is that we have the mesophyll cells. There are mesophyll cells in the leaf, and just beneath the mesophyll cells, there are epidermal cells in the epidermis and also the guard cells. So what happens during transpiration is that first, the water evaporates from the cell walls of the mesophyll cells. Mesophyll cells are moist. They're moist with water. These are the mesophyll cell walls. Water evaporates from the mesophyll cell walls, and then the water diffuses via the stomata, which are the pores between the guard cells. This is known as transpiration. This is the guard cell. So I hope you get it. The answer is P. Evaporation of water at the surface of the mesophyll cells and it's lost through the stomata is known as transpiration. How do veins differ from the arteries? Guys do know that veins have a wider lumen. Veins have thinner walls as compared to the artery. Arteries have a narrower lumen. Veins have a wider lumen. Veins have wider lumen as compared to arteries. Veins have thinner walls as compared to arteries. Veins have less elastic fibers and less muscle tissue in their walls. So the answer is D. Let's move on to MCQ number 14. Sickle cell anemia is an inherited condition which causes abnormal red blood cells. Which health problem will be caused by the change in the red blood cells? Okay, so in sickle cell anemia, which is an inherited condition, it's a genetic disease. It's passed on from the parents to offspring. So this results in an abnormal red blood cells. So what will be the health problem caused by it? Blood will not be able to clot when bleeding occurs. No, this cannot be the answer because blood clotting is the function of platelets. Red blood cells have nothing to do with this. Blood cells will not be able to form antibodies. Antibodies are formed by lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cells. So red blood cells have nothing to do with antibodies. Glucose levels in the blood plasma will become too low. The maintenance of glucose concentration is not a role of red blood cells. Glucose concentration is maintained by the liver, the pancreas, right? Blood will not be able to carry the normal amount of oxygen. This is the true answer because red blood cells are involved in the transport of oxygen. And if the red blood cells become abnormal in sickle cell anemia, they will not be able to carry normal amount of oxygen. So the answer is D. The diagram shows the pressure. The diagram shows the pressures in the left side of the heart during one heartbeat. MCQ number 15. The diagram shows the pressures in the left side of the heart during one heartbeat. So guys, this graph is showing the pressure changes that occur on the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart includes the left ventricle, the left atrium, and aorta. So to solve these MCQs in few seconds, just few seconds, I have some tip for you. Basically, this graph shows the pressure changes in 3 parts of the left side of the heart. These include left ventricle, aorta, and left atrium. So guys, where the graphs meet, wherever the graphs meet, the valves are opened or valves are closed. So you can make a point over here. This is the first intersection point. You can label it as A. This is the second intersection point. You can label it as B. This is the third intersection point. You can label it as C. And this is the fourth intersection point. You can label it as D. Always remember that while you are labeling these points A, B, C, and D, remember that the heartbeat starts from this point when the pressure of the left atrium is rising. This is the line of the left atrium, you can see. And when the left atrial pressure rises, it means the heartbeat is starting. Because when the heartbeat starts, the atria, the left atrium and the right atrium, they contract together. So as the heartbeat starts, the first intersection point on the graph is A, then B, then C, and then D. So at these points, valves are either opened or closed. That means they will either open or they will close. So I have a mnemonic for you that is Bob, Coco. Right? And how do you use this mnemonic on these points? You can remember this by following Bob, Coco. So at point A, what happens? Bicuspid valve closes. BC means bicuspid valve closes. Then point B. At point B, AO means aortic valve opens. Aortic valve is also known as semilunar valve. At point C, what happens? Aortic valve closes. AO means aortic valve closes. Aortic valve is also known as semilunar. And at point, this was point C, and at point D, what happens? BO, that is bicuspid valve opens. All right. So the question says which valves are open and which are closed at the time marked X. So X is the time between C and D. At C, what happens? Aortic valve is closed, or we can say at C, aortic valve closes. So X is a point between C and D. At D, bicuspid valve opens. So between C and D, aortic valve is closed and bicuspid valve is also closed. Are you getting my point? At C, aortic valve closes. So after C, aortic valve will be closed, right? And at D, bicuspid valve opens. So X is before D. So bicuspid valve must be closed because bicuspid valve was closed at A and now it will open at D. So at X, which is some point before D, bicuspid valve will be closed, and X is some point just after C. It means aortic valve is also closed. So both the valves are closed, and the answer is A. So I hope this mnemonic will help you in solving these MCQs within seconds. Always remember that you have to make the intersection points from where the heartbeat starts. And as I mentioned, that heartbeat starts where you see the rising level of the pressure in the left atrium. Okay, let's move on to MCQ number 16. What are the uses of energy from respiration? So guys, do remember that active transport is a process which requires energy because molecules and ions move against the concentration gradient, that is from lower concentration to higher concentration. Guys, diffusion never requires energy. Diffusion is passive. It does not require energy because molecules are moving from higher concentration to lower concentration, and molecules can do that by random movement. There is no need for energy. Cell division requires energy. Always remember that because for cell division, protein synthesis is required. For cell division, the cell must split into two, the nucleus must split into two, and that these processes require energy. Osmosis is a special type of diffusion in which water molecules are diffusing from a higher water potential to lower water potential. So again, osmosis is a passive process that does not require energy. The answer is B. Let's move on to the next MCQ, that is MCQ number 17. Which statements about gases exchange in the alveoli are correct? The alveolus wall is 1 cell thick. If we recall the gas exchange across the alveoli, so this is the alveolus, and please note that the wall of the alveolus is made up of a single layer of cells. So we can say that alveolus or the wall of the alveolus is 1 cell thick. These are the cells which make up the wall of the alveolus. This is alveolus, and alveolus is surrounded by a blood capillary which contains the red blood cells. Okay, so now let's read the statements. We need to take those statements which are correct. The alveolus wall is 1 cell thick. This is true. Carbon dioxide can diffuse through the alveolus wall. Definitely. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood plasma into the alveolus from a higher concentration in blood to lower concentration in alveolus. Alveolus has a lower concentration of carbon dioxide and blood has a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide can diffuse through the alveolus wall. This is true. And also note that there's a film of moisture. There's a film of moisture around the wall of the alveolus. This moisture is basically water and some other compounds. So whenever oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, it dissolves in this moisture and then processes. So the last statement is oxygen dissolves in the moisture on the surface of the alveolus before diffusing into the blood. So this statement is also true. The answer is 1, 2, and 3. D. Okay, let's move on to MCQ number 18. This is a very good MCQ. The graph shows records of a person's breathing at rest and during exercise. What is the increase in breathing rate when the person is at rest and then exercises? So guys, we have to compare the breathing rates and then we have to state the increase in the breathing rate, right? Let's see what is the breathing rate at rest. Always remember that breathing rate is always calculated in per minute. Whenever we are calculating breathing rate, it's always breaths per minute. So in 1 minute, there are how many seconds? 60 seconds. And the one wave over here is one breath. How? The lung volume increases when you inhale, and the lung volume decreases when you exhale. So this is one breath. Then again you inhale, and then you exhale. This is the next breath, right? So one wave is one breath. Let's count how many breaths are there in 60 seconds or 1 minute when the person is at rest. First breath, second, 3 breaths, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So at rest, the breathing rate is 12 breaths per minute. Okay. Let's calculate the breathing rate during exercise. So again, breathing rate should be calculated per minute. Let's count the number of waves in 60 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 breaths. Okay, so we can say there are 21 breaths per minute or in 60 seconds, right? So what is the increase in breathing rate? The breathing rate increased from 9 to 21. That is the breathing rate has increased from 12 breaths per minute to 21 breaths per minute. That is the increase of 9 breaths per minute, right? The breathing rate at rest was 12 breaths per minute, and during exercise, it's 21 breaths per minute. So there's an increase of 9 breaths per minute. What is the increase in breathing rate when the person is at rest and then exercises? The answer is 9 breaths per minute, the option A. Okay, let's move on to the next MCQ, that is MCQ number 19. Which diagram shows the diffusion of substances between the blood and the dialysis fluid during dialysis? So guys, remember that glucose can cross the dialysis membrane, but as you all know, that blood and dialysis fluid have equal concentrations of glucose. So there is no net movement of glucose. What is meant by no net movement of glucose? The amount of glucose that goes into the dialysis fluid from the blood is the same as the glucose that comes from the dialysis fluid back into the blood, right? So glucose diffuses, but glucose passes through the dialysis membrane, but it does not diffuse. Okay, let me correct myself that there is no diffusion. Diffusion is the net movement of glucose, right? If I'm saying that glucose is diffusing, that means there is net movement. But actually, there is no net movement. Glucose is not diffusing. Glucose is just crossing the dialysis membrane, and the amount of glucose that goes from the blood to the dialysis fluid is equal to the amount of glucose that comes from the dialysis fluid to the blood. So there is no change in glucose in the blood, and glucose does not diffuse. Proteins are too large to pass through. So the movement of glucose was true. Proteins are too large to cross the dialysis membrane. This is true as well. This is wrong. Salts can cross the dialysis membrane. So option A cannot be right. Let's move on to option B. This says that glucose cannot diffuse through the dialysis membrane. Well, glucose cannot diffuse through the dialysis membrane. It's true, glucose cannot diffuse through the dialysis membrane, but glucose can cross the dialysis membrane. In this option, glucose is not crossing the dialysis membrane. This is wrong. And this shows that proteins can cross the dialysis membrane. Again, this is wrong. Option C is wrong again because it states that glucose cannot cross the dialysis membrane. However, it can. And let's move on to option D. Option D states that glucose can cross the dialysis membrane, but there is no net movement or diffusion. This is true. Proteins cannot cross the dialysis membrane because proteins are too large to pass through. This is true as well. Guys, salts can cross the dialysis membrane. However, there is no net movement because the concentration of salts in the blood and dialysis fluid are equal. Same goes for water. No net movement. However, if the blood has a lower concentration of salts and a lower water potential of water, so salts can come from the dialysis fluid to the blood. And in case water is in excess or salts are in excess, they can go from the blood to the dialysis fluid. Always remember that urea moves from the blood to the dialysis fluid because in dialysis fluid there is no urea. And in blood, there is very high concentration of urea. So urea flows from the blood to the dialysis fluid only. So the answer is D. D is the correct representation of the substances crossing the dialysis membrane during the dialysis. Let's move on to the MCQ number 20. After exercise, human body temperature often rises above normal. Right? Whenever we exercise, our body temperature rises above normal. What will help to return the temperature to normal? As you all know, that when the body temperature increases, what happens? A lot of changes within the body occur, and these changes include sweating and vasodilation, that is the widening of the arterioles close to the skin surface. So more blood flows close to the skin surface. So the answer will be D, dilation of blood vessels in the skin. When the body temperature rises, blood vessels in the skin dilate, more blood flows into the skin, and more heat losses occur, so that the body temperature can fall back to normal. There is a negative feedback mechanism and not a positive feedback mechanism. There is not a hormonal response causing shivering when the body temperature rises. There is no shivering, and temperature regulation is mainly regulated by the nervous system. An increase in the fat layer under the skin. This does not occur, and this change is long term, not short term, right? So to return temperature to normal, there will never be a change in the fat layer, because returning back of temperature to normal is a fast response, and changes in the thickness of the fat layer are very slow. So A cannot be the option. Okay, let's move on to the next MCQ, that is MCQ number 21. The diagrams show the front view of the pupil and the iris of the eye in different light intensities. Which row correctly describes the diagram X? So guys, we can see that at X, the pupil is dilated, or we can say the diameter of the pupil is higher, which means that the person is in dim light. When we are in dim light, or when we are in the dark, the pupils dilate. So always remember that D for dim light, D for dilate. What about circular muscles and radial muscles? So I teach my students the rule of 3 C's. What is meant by the rule of 3 C's? Whenever circular muscles contract, what happens? Whenever circular muscles contract, pupil constrict. So this is the rule of 3 C's. Circular muscles, when they contract, the pupil constricts. So in this case, pupil is dilated. So circular muscles are obviously not contracting, they are relaxing. And always remember that circular muscles of the iris and the radial muscles of the iris are antagonistic. When one relaxes, the other contracts. So if the circular muscle is relaxing, the radial muscle is contracting. The answer is C. Let's discuss MCQ number 22. The diagram shows some of the nerve pathways associated with the reflex action. If the pathway at X is damaged, how does this affect the reflex? So guys, what is meant by reflex action? Reflex action is defined as a fast, involuntary response to a stimulus. And what does that mean? This means that if there is a dangerous stimulus, like something which causes pain, or a hot cup, for example, if we touch a hot cup, what happens? The hand withdraws automatically. We don't do it. Everything happens unconsciously or subconsciously. So the action that happens is an automatic action, and this is known as the reflex action. Reflex action is very, very fast. It's involuntary, which means it's not in our control. And it's a response to a dangerous stimulus, which could be pain, which could be heat, or any other dangerous stimulus. So guys, do remember that for reflex action to occur, you need a reflex arc, which is the pathway along which the nerve impulses must flow. So the reflex action is basically a response that arises due to the flow of nerve impulses. And these nerve impulses flow along a particular pathway. So over here, we can see a reflex arc as well. Always note that reflex arc involves a receptor and then a neuron, which is a sensory neuron, which will carry the electrical impulse to the central nervous system. So in this case, the electrical impulse was generated in the pain receptor, and the electrical impulse was carried by the sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Which part of the central nervous system? The unconscious regions, like the spinal cord or some unconscious regions of the brain. It depends that which part of the body is associated with the reflex. The reflexes of the head are dealt by the brain, and the reflexes below the head are dealt by the spinal cord. Whatever the case, the reflex arc through which the nerve impulses must flow includes the receptor, the sensory neuron, and then the electrical impulses flow along the relay neuron, which is found in the CNS or central nervous system. So this is the relay neuron, and then the electrical impulse or the nerve impulse passes through the motor neuron. So this one, the next neuron, is the motor neuron. Motor neuron carries the electrical impulse from the relay neuron to the effector, which could be a muscle or a gland. So this motor neuron is carrying the electrical impulse from the CNS to the effector, in which case this is the muscle. Why? Because the person needs to withdraw the hand or withdraw some part of the body because of the pain, right? So I hope you guys understood the reflex arc. There's always a reflex arc through which the electrical impulses or nerve impulses must flow to bring about reflex action. And reflex arc involves a receptor, a sensory neuron, a relay neuron, which is always found within CNS. And then a motor neuron, which carries the electrical impulses from the CNS to the effector. Do remember that sensory neuron carries electrical impulses from the receptor to the CNS. Okay, so this was the reflex arc along which the electrical impulses or the nerve impulses were flowing to bring about the reflex shown. However, there are some additional pathways. This is a branch of the sensory neuron through which I'm drawing the arrows. The arrows I'm drawing are through another pathway which is carrying the electrical impulse to the brain, and most probably these regions are the conscious regions. And then there's a motor neuron which is bringing electrical impulses from the brain, right? Sensory neuron takes the impulses to the brain, the conscious regions of the brain, and the motor neuron takes the electrical impulses from the brain, right? Now they say that there is a damage at part X or damage at the point X. So what will happen? The point X is on the neuron, which is bringing the input from the brain. And as we all know that the input from the brain is always regarding the movement. It's through the motor neuron. So what will be the answer? If the pathway at X is damaged, how does this affect the reflex? The person will not be aware that the reflex is occurring. The person will be aware because senses are going to the brain. Damage is at X. The reflex cannot be controlled consciously. This is true because the conscious input that was coming from the brain is lost because of the damage at X. So the option B is true. The reflex cannot be consciously controlled. The response will occur without any stimulus. No, response cannot occur without any stimulus. There is no response to the stimulus. Guys, response will occur. This statement is false. Response will occur because reflex arc is intact. Response is due to the reflex arc, and reflex arc is very well intact. The answer is B. Let's move on to the next MCQ, that is MCQ number 23. What occurs after an injection of insulin? So as you all know that when the insulin is injected, it targets the liver to take up more glucose from the blood and convert this glucose into glycogen. So what happens when the insulin injection is injected, or when the insulin injection is given, or when the insulin is injected, the production of glycogen by the liver increases because insulin increases the uptake of glucose into the liver cells and stimulates the liver cells to convert this glucose into glycogen. Let's move on to MCQ number 24. Which bones form the hinge joint at the forelimb? So guys, at the forelimb, which is the lower limb, the hinge joint that is formed is actually the elbow joint. And as you all know, the bones that form the elbow joint are humerus, number 1, ulna, number 4, and the radius, number 2. So the answer is 1, 2, and 4. Humerus, radius, and ulna. They make up the elbow joint, which is the hinge joint actually. The type of joint is the hinge joint, and the name of the joint is the elbow joint. Okay. MCQ number 25. In an experiment, a person tested their reactions by measuring the time taken to catch a ruler that was drawn by another person. Then they repeated the test sometime after drinking alcohol. Which graph shows the results? So guys, do remember that what alcohol does, alcohol increases the reaction time. Alcohol increases reaction time. So when a person consumes alcohol, it will take more time for him to react to catch a ruler, right? That's why alcohol is not legalized, or we can say that's why we cannot consume alcohol while driving, because in any case, if a car comes in front of us while driving, we need to react immediately and stop before we collide into the car in front of us. That's why alcohol is not allowed while driving, because it increases the reaction time. So which graph shows their results? So guys, before consuming alcohol, the time taken to catch the ruler will be less because the reaction time will be less. The person will react quickly. But after consuming alcohol, what will happen? The reaction time will increase. The reaction time to catch the ruler will increase. So the answer is A. MCQ number 26. What is the feature of all bacteria? They are parasites? No, not all bacteria are parasites. Bacteria are parasites. Some bacteria are parasites, not all. Some bacteria can also photosynthesize. So in that case, they will make their own carbohydrates, and they do not need to feed on other organisms. Parasites are those microorganisms which feed on other organisms, right? So not all bacteria are parasites. Some obtain their energy by photosynthesis. Some make their carbohydrates by photosynthesis. Some obtain energy by nitrogen fixation, nitrifying, and denitrification. Bacteria never have a nucleus. They never have a nucleus. They are made up of hyphae. No. Multicellular fungi are made up of hyphae. They are single-celled organisms. This is true for all the bacteria. All the bacteria are unicellular or single-celled organisms. MCQ number 27. What is the main role of yeast in the production of beers and wines? Beers and wines contain ethanol. So because yeast respires anaerobically, producing ethanol by fermentation, this is the main role of yeast in the production of beers and wines. What is food chain? So guys, food chain is simply a diagram that shows the flow of energy through a chain of organisms. There will be a chain of organisms, one after another, and the arrows will show the feeding relationship or the flow of energy. Option A is similar, but just be careful. It is misleading. A diagram showing an organism, no, multiple organisms, getting its energy by feeding on other organisms, no. Food chain never shows one organism feeding on many. Food chain shows a chain of organisms along which there is a flow of energy, and the diagram exactly shows the flow of energy. So the option is C. Why is it important that carbon is recycled or cycled in nature? That's because living organisms need carbon compounds to make proteins. If carbon is not recycled, so the living organisms will not get carbon and they will not be able to make new proteins. This is the far best option. We can also go through other options. Carbon compounds needed by living organisms are produced in respiration? No. Carbon compounds are never produced in respiration. They are produced in photosynthesis. Do remember that carbon compounds needed by living organisms are produced in photosynthesis, because we need glucose, and glucose is produced in photosynthesis. That is the carbon compound that we need, that the living organisms need. So this is option A is wrong. Carbon dioxide is needed by animals for respiration. No, carbon dioxide is required for photosynthesis and not for respiration. Trees take in less carbon dioxide for photosynthesis than they produce in respiration. No, rate of photosynthesis is much higher in plants as compared to the rate of respiration. So plants take up a lot more carbon dioxide in for photosynthesis than they produce in respiration. So all the other options are wrong. The carbon should be recycled in nature so that the living organisms can get the carbon compounds to make the new proteins. If the carbon is recycled in nature, what will happen? Carbon dioxide will be absorbed by the plants to make carbohydrates in photosynthesis, and these carbohydrates will actually be the carbon compounds that will be used to make new proteins. So the answer was C. Let's move on to MCQ number 30. The diagram shows part of the nitrogen cycle. What are the processes P, Q, R, and S? Okay. So always remember that atmospheric nitrogen is N2. And whenever you convert atmospheric nitrogen into compounds of nitrogen, for example, organic substances. Organic substances are basically we can say proteins or any other organic substance, which could be a fertilizer as well, right? But it should be organic, not inorganic. We have organic fertilizers as well. For example, urea, right? Urea is an organic fertilizer. That is CO, NH2 taken twice. So whenever you convert atmospheric nitrogen into any compound, right, that contains nitrogen, the process is nitrogen fixation. Organic substances could be proteins as well, right? Proteins are also organic. Now, atmospheric nitrogen to nitrogen in plants. So remember that nitrogen in plants are again what? Proteins. So again, this is nitrogen fixation. Whenever you convert nitrogen into any compound, for example, when you convert it into nitrate, whenever you convert it into ammonium, whenever you convert it into, for example, urea or any other compound proteins, that is nitrogen fixation. Right? So P and Q are nitrogen fixation. What about R? Whenever you convert ammonium compounds to nitrates, that is nitrification. So R is nitrification. Nitrification is when ammonium compounds or ammonium is converted first into nitrites, NO2 minus, and then to nitrates, NO3 minus. This process is nitrification, and this is done by nitrifying bacteria. What is S? In S, organic substances like proteins or urea are converting into ammonia. So basically, this is decomposition, or we can say ammonification. The answer is D. Draining stagnant water is one method of controlling the malarial mosquito. Which stages in the mosquito life cycle does this method affect? So guys, as you all know that adult mosquitoes lay their eggs in the stagnant water, a water which is stagnant and is not moving, right? These eggs hatch into larvae. So larvae are basically baby mosquitoes which are just born, and larvae stay in water. They don't come into air, they stay in water. Then larva grows into pupa, pupa still stays in water. And when the pupa grows into adult mosquito, it comes into the air. So only adult mosquito is in air. Do remember that, A for adult, A for air. Only adult mosquito is in air, while all the other stages in the mosquito life cycle, they are in the water. Like eggs will be laid in water, larva will be in the water, and pupa will be in the water. So if we drain the stagnant water, eggs, larvae, and pupa will be affected and not the adult. So do remember that when eggs hatch, larvae come out of the eggs. These are the smallest of all mosquitoes. Then larvae grow into pupa, and then pupa grows into adult. Adult mosquitoes are in air, whereas the eggs, larvae, and pupa are in the stagnant water. So the answer was C, 31. Sorry, 31B. Answer was B, not C, 31B. Let's move on to MCQ number 32. The diagram shows the source and the effect of four air pollutants. What are the four air pollutants? So number one, air pollutant causes acid rain and its source is fossil fuels. Okay, so sulfur dioxide causes acid rain, as we all know. Number two, the source is fossil fuels and the effect is greenhouse effect. So obviously carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas which is increasing the global warming, and the source is fossil fuels. By the burning of fossil fuels, we get carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Rice fields. Whenever the bacteria decay on the dead rice plants, a gas called methane is produced, which is also a greenhouse gas. So pollutant 3 is methane. Methane is formed by the bacterial decay of vegetable matter, for example, in the rice fields. And motor vehicles, as we all know, in the car engines, nitrogen and oxygen gases, they both react to form nitrogen oxides that can cause acid rain. So the answer is B. The diagram, MCQ number 33, the diagram shows the mass of the DNA in cells which are dividing. Which row describes this type of cell division? Okay, so what do you observe? That initially the mass of DNA was 8, then it doubled, and then it returned back to the same number, that is 8. So before division, the DNA was 8, and after division, before division, the mass of the DNA was 8, and after division, the mass of the DNA is still 8. It means there is no change in DNA or chromosome number. And as we all know, that the division in which there is no change in the chromosome number or the DNA is mitosis. The division in which the chromosome number is maintained or the DNA is maintained is known as the mitosis. And mitosis is involved in asexual reproduction, not sexual. And obviously, by asexual reproduction, genetically identical offspring are produced. The answer is C. MCQ number 34, the graph shows changes in the dry mass of a seed as it germinates and grows. What causes the change shown between points S and T? Okay, so as we all know, that when the seed germinates, it breaks down all the stored starch in respiration, right? Initially, what happens that the dry mass of the seed decreases because the seed is only respiring, right? There's only respiration. So what happens that the starch in the seed is broken down into glucose, and that glucose is broken down in respiration. So the seed is losing its dry mass because mass is converted into energy. What happens from S to T? From S to T, the leaves grow well. The seedling has grown well and the leaves are developed. So from S to T, the photosynthesis starts. And as you all know, photosynthesis converts energy to mass. Photosynthesis traps. In photosynthesis, plants or leaves using chlorophyll, they trap light energy from the sun and store it in carbohydrates, right? The photosynthesis occurs from S to T. Respiration also occurs, but photosynthesis also occurs, and rate of photosynthesis is higher, so the mass increases, dry mass increases. What causes the change shown between S and T? The answer will be photosynthesis and not respiration, because respiration decreases the mass. The mass increases mainly due to photosynthesis. More photosynthesis occurs than respiration. So overall, there is an increase in the mass. The increase in mass is done by the photosynthesis because energy is being converted into mass. In photosynthesis, the plants or the leaves are trapping light energy and converting that into chemical energy, and chemical energy is absorbed in the carbohydrates. And new carbohydrates are being formed, so mass is increased. MCQ number 35, the graph shows the concentration in the blood of the 3 of the 4 hormones, FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone during a menstrual cycle. Which hormone is not shown? Okay, let me tell you how to identify the graphs of different hormones involved in the menstrual cycle. Okay, so there are 4 hormones, FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. Remember that a hormone which peaks at day 14. Throughout the menstrual cycle, the hormone will be low in blood. The level of the hormone or the concentration of hormone in the blood will stay low for a hormone throughout, but it will peak at day 14, or we can say it will suddenly surge at day 14 to maximum point. This hormone is LH. Always remember that. LH is low at the start. It suddenly surges at day 14 and then comes down again. So this is how you can identify the hormone LH. What about progesterone? Progesterone is a hormone which stays low till the day 14 and rises after day 14 and peaks at about day 24 and then falls. This is progesterone. So how do you recognize progesterone? Progesterone is a hormone which stays low till day 14 and suddenly rises after day 14 and reaches its peak. So this hormone is progesterone, the red one. What about FSH? FSH is a hormone which rises initially in the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle, then it falls, and then there's a sudden overshoot, or we can say sudden surge, but a little surge at day 14 and then returns to the normal level. This is FSH. So obviously, which hormone is not shown? Estrogen. So what will be the graph of estrogen? Let me draw it for you. Estrogen initially is low, but as the FSH rises, estrogen also rises and then reaches the peak at day 13, and then it falls, and then again it rises after day 14 together with progesterone. So this is the hormone. This is the graph for the hormone estrogen. What are the features of estrogen? Estrogen reaches its peak at day 13. And then it falls, and then it rises again together with progesterone, but it will be lower than the progesterone in the concentration in blood. So which hormone was not shown? Estrogen was not shown. The answer is C. MCQ number 36. The table gives statements about HIV. Which row correctly marks the statements as true or false? All HIV positive people develop AIDS. Is it true or false? It's not necessary that anyone who gets HIV also develops AIDS. There are some people who stay HIV positive throughout their lives but never develop AIDS. That's maybe because of the drugs that they are taking. If someone is tested positive for HIV, initially when somebody gets the virus, the AIDS does not develop immediately. For example, if a person is if a person gets HIV, if a person comes in contact with someone who has HIV, and if the person gets HIV, the person will not develop AIDS immediately. It takes 10 to 15 years for AIDS to develop. And if that person gets tested for HIV and gets a positive result for HIV, then he can take anti-HIV drugs. So in that case, the person will never develop AIDS because the drugs will prevent the development of AIDS, although the person will be HIV positive. So it's not necessary that all the HIV positive people will develop AIDS. Most of the people with HIV develop AIDS, but some do not, maybe because of the treatment, or maybe because of their immune system or other genetic factors. An unborn baby is at risk if their mother is HIV positive? Yes. If the mother is HIV positive, the unborn baby is definitely at risk because the HIV virus can cross the placenta and enter the unborn baby. So the answer is A. What is an example of discontinuous variation in humans? So for discontinuous variation, always remember that how do you recognize that which characteristic belongs to discontinuous variation? There are few features that you need to know of discontinuous variation. In case of discontinuous variation, there will be very few phenotypes. There will be very few values. For height, we have a lot of values. For hair color, we have a lot of values because there are many different shades of hair color. For masses, we have a lot of values. But for blood group, we only have 4 blood groups: A, B, AB, and O. Right? So how to recognize that? How to recognize which characteristic belongs to which variation, continuous or discontinuous? For discontinuous variation, always remember that phenotypes will be very few. And there will be no intermediates between the phenotypes. So there is no intermediate between the blood group B and O. There is no intermediate. There is no intermediate between the blood group A and AB and A and B. There is no intermediate. A is different, AB is different, B is different, there is no intermediate. So when there are no intermediates, when there are no continuous values, the trait belongs to discontinuous variation. The answer is B. Blood group is an example of discontinuous variation. Okay, MCQ number 38. One gene has 2 codominant alleles, A, E, and AF, and 1 recessive allele, AG. How many different genotypes and phenotypes are possible? So guys, how do we write the possible phenotypes and possible genotypes? Always remember that for possible genotypes, what you do? Genotypes or a genotype is defined as combination of 2 alleles, right? A person can have combination of 2 alleles of a gene a person can have is known as the genotype. So if we make combinations out of these 3 alleles, what can be the combinations? Combination could be AE. This could be one genotype. Then AEAF. This could be another genotype. Then AEAG. This could be another genotype. Then let's make AF and AG, or AF first, and then AF AG, and then AG AG. So guys, these are the 6 phenotypes which are possible. Only these genotypes are possible. There are no other genotypes besides these which are possible. So 6 genotypes are possible. What about phenotypes? Let's write the possible phenotypes. Phenotype, what is phenotype actually? Phenotype is a visible characteristic that we see in an individual, and phenotypes always depend on genotypes. So AE means the phenotype will be E. We don't know what is the trait, but it will be somewhat due to these genes or alleles. If they are saying that the allele is AE, so maybe we can write it like this, that phenotype would be E, because they haven't mentioned about any phenotype. What about AE and AF? AE and AF are codominant, so the phenotype that we get will be a mixture of E and F, for example. What about AE and AG? Because E is dominant, so the phenotype will be E. G is recessive, right? What about AF? AF, the phenotype will be F. What about FG? F is dominant and G is recessive, so the trait will be F. And what about AG? The trait will be G because both alleles are recessive. So how many different phenotypes do you get? E, EF, F, and G. So 4 types of different phenotypes you get. The answer is C. What is the result of natural selection? Dogs that are friendly to humans. Guys, this is an example of artificial selection. Dogs that are friendly to humans are made by artificial selection. How? Let me tell you that female dogs that were friendly to the humans were crossed with male dogs that were friendly to humans. In this way, the offspring were produced. Then, out of all the offspring, the dog which was very friendly to the humans was selected. For example, a female dog who was very friendly among the offspring was selected and crossed with his with her brother dog, which was also friendly. And then they were allowed to breed. They were crossed, and the offspring appeared. And again, those dogs which were friendly were selected. So in this way, by artificial selection, we got dogs that were very friendly to humans. So option A is artificial selection and not natural selection. Grapes that contain no seeds. Guys, to produce grapes without seeds, we need asexual reproduction, because for sexual reproduction, seeds will always be produced. So grapes that contain no seeds is an example of asexual reproduction. We are producing grapes asexually, And whenever we talk about natural selection and artificial selection, there is always sexual reproduction. Always remember that. Natural selection and artificial selection can occur by sexual reproduction, never by asexual. Mosquitoes that are resistant to insecticides, yes, this is an example of natural selection. Why? Because we were spraying insecticides in the environment. So environment changed, right? Environment was full of insecticides. And mosquitoes that were not resistant to the insecticides, they died. Some were, however, resistant because of the mutations that occurred in those mosquitoes, right? So in some mosquitoes, mutations occurred and they become resistant to insecticides, while the others were non-resistant. So all the non-resistant mosquitoes died because of the insecticides, whereas the resistant ones, they survived and they reproduced and passed on the favorable alleles to their offspring. So all the mosquitoes became resistant to insecticides. This is natural selection. Guys, how do we know that one example is of natural selection or artificial selection? Always remember that there seem to be any natural process, right? Natural selection is when the environment selects. When we are spraying insecticides, we are changing the environment, and that environment is selecting the mosquitoes. The environment selects those mosquitoes which are resistant and favors their survival. Those which are not resistant, they die. So this is natural selection actually, right? And you can also notice one thing, that any characteristic which is favorable to us will be an example of artificial selection. For example, dogs that become friendly to humans, environment would never want that. That is wanted by humans. So that is artificial selection. Mosquitoes that are resistant to insecticides, we never want mosquitoes to become resistant to insecticides. So that occurred because of the natural selection. We never wanted to do that. Part D, onion crops that have pleasant taste. Again, this is some characteristic which is present to humans. So this is something that we have done. This is artificial selection, right? So if you are confused in any example, whether is it artificial selection or natural selection, always remember that. Always note one thing, that the change that you observe, is that the humans want, or is that change is wanted by the environment? Environment wants mosquitoes to survive. So they're becoming resistant to insecticides. However, we want mosquitoes to die. We want onion crops that have very pleasant taste. So obviously we have selected those onion crops that have pleasant taste and we allowed them to breed. This is artificial selection. And we want dogs that are friendly to us. So we chose those dogs which were friendly and we allowed them to breed. Okay. MCQ number 40. During the division of nucleus by meiosis. During the division of nucleus by meiosis, changes can happen that produce a gamete with an abnormal number of genes or chromosomes. Which change might produce a gamete that can result in a child having Down syndrome? So the answer is a gamete with one extra chromosome. As you all know, what happens in Down syndrome is that during meiosis, what happens, that in one parent, the gamete that is formed is absolutely normal. It contains 23 chromosomes. This gamete is absolutely normal. Whereas in the other parent, the gamete that forms contains an extra chromosome. This is the abnormal gamete, which contains extra chromosome, 24 chromosomes. This is the error that occurs during meiosis. And what happens if this gamete with an extra chromosome fuses with a normal gamete? What will happen? By fertilization, a zygote will form, which will have how many chromosomes? 47 chromosomes. And when this zygote develops into a child or into a baby, that baby has Down's syndrome. So when this zygote develops into a baby, so this baby has Down syndrome. Okay. So the change that occur during the division for Down syndrome to occur is the formation of a gamete with one extra chromosome.